A famous man once said, "We create our own demons." Who said that? What does that even mean? Doesn't matter. I said it because he said it. So now he was famous and basically getting said by two well-known guys. I'm going to start again. Let's track this from the beginning.
When you spend your childhood in a relatively stable and affluent American family home environment, you occupy a version of reality that's considerably more sheltered and sterilized than that which most people in the world tend to experience. In an environment like this, you can generally be sure that you'll be well cared for and safe, and that most authority figures mean well and certainly try their best to do well. However, it's only once you start to get older that you kind of start to realize just how much of the world seems poised to come completely unglued at the seams. I can remember the series of world events that caused me to start to lose some of my childhood innocence. It started with a news broadcast on my family TV about the collapse of democracy in Iraq and the rise of the terror group ISIS in the summer of 2014.
June 2014, Islamic State fighters begin a major offensive against the Iraqi government. In a matter of days, their black banner flies over nearly half the country's territory and soon over large areas of northeast Syria too. The international community is taken by surprise by the rise of the group, a mix of former Saddam Hussein troops and Sunni Muslims fighting the regime of Bashar al-Assad. On June 29th, their leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declares a caliphate across Iraq and Syria.
I had no idea about all of these complex geopolitical factors, but I was struck by the imagery that I was seeing on my TV. Violent, angry mobs marched down city streets that were being ransacked, vandalized, and even set on fire. People who were declared as enemies of the terrorist organization were being beaten or even executed. It was all just crazy. I just didn't understand how people could participate in such extreme acts of violence and cruelty towards their own community. And when I asked about what I was seeing, I was told by the adults around me that basically the United States fought this war in Iraq that nobody wanted to fight and did such a bad job of getting out of the war that terrorists ended up taking over. Well, for the first time in my life, I started to realize that the people in charge don't necessarily always do the right thing, and sometimes they can't even be sure what the right thing is. News about ISIS and the growing terror threat started to spread into other aspects of my life, most especially at church. When ISIS took over the Iraqi city of Mosul and ordered its 60,000 Christians to either leave the area, convert, or face execution, my pastor had a whole sermon about what was going on. And in fact, in children's church, we kids were told that we might one day face the same choice, and that we needed to make sure that we didn't deny our faith even in front of a terrorist. I was old enough to be pretty sure that the odds of facing that particular scenario were kind of slim, but the implications of what I was hearing week after week had me worried about the distant odds of it nonetheless. In fact, it wasn't too much longer after this before radical Islamic terror attacks started spreading across Europe and North America like a virus. Now, it wasn't just my church that was talking about these things, but the wider community at large, including in my school. The West's failure to engineer a better political situation in Iraq had backfired so completely that the consequences were starting to be felt closer and closer to home. This was my first introduction to the concept of blowback, which is described as the adverse consequences of a political action or situation, especially political actions which hurt the very people that they are intended to benefit. My second introduction to blowback happened even closer to home.
Tonight, we have witnessed lawlessness and chaos on the streets as the violence escalates despite calls for peace. All this in the wake of today's funeral for a young man who died of severe injuries while in police custody.
I'm here in Baltimore City, where in the spring of 2015, riots broke out following Freddie Gray's death in police custody.
These young men are incredibly angry. As you can see, there is a lot of emotion running through the streets here.
For almost a month, city officials struggled to reestablish public order as rioters and looters ransacked and vandalized businesses, assaulted police officers and journalists, and set fire to properties around the city. I watched the news as night after night, the same imagery that I saw when ISIS took over Iraq was now playing out in a city that I lived only 10 miles away from.
Tonight, the horror erupting across Baltimore. Demonstrators jumping on police cars, setting some on fire. The city erupting in rock-throwing, rubber bullet shooting chaos. Looters robbing stores in broad daylight. Hundreds of police in riot gear trying to regain control of the streets around a mall less than a mile from where Freddie Gray was arrested. Most of the protesters were young people, some wearing masks, all refusing to back off. Police moving them back forcefully with shields and batons. But the protesters' rocks often hit their targets. We saw multiple officers injured. Most have broken bones, say police. We were there as this riot-geared officer was loaded into an armored vehicle for safety. He'd been hit. The police spokesman visibly angry.
Grievances from the people about the practices of the city police, including the unjust treatment of Freddie Gray, had been left unresolved for years. At the same time, the people who were participating in the violence and property destruction were failed by their community because they should have been raised better. The corrupt and weak Baltimore City government was unable to solve the issues that led to the rioting. And when violence finally broke out, that same government also struggled to reestablish order. It wasn't until the National Guard was deployed in May that peace was finally brought back to the city. But there was a lasting stain left behind by the riots, both on the city itself and probably my psyche as well. The idea that an entire city full of people could go from docile and peaceful one moment to completely falling apart the next stuck with me. It told me something about the capacity for destruction and violence that resides within every person. All it takes is the right set of conditions for that side of a person to be activated. In this video, I want to talk about Blowback from American Foreign Policy Decisions, how American mistakes abroad have made the world a more dangerous place.
I mean, I know you're a sophisticated guy. The world is a mess. The world is as angry as it gets. Well, you think this is going to cause a little more anger? The world is an angry place. All of this has happened. We went into Iraq. We shouldn't have gone into Iraq. We shouldn't have gotten out the way we got out. The world is a total mess. The world is a mess, David.
There is no better place to start when focusing on the issue of blowback than the Middle East. There have been multiple prolonged wars and failed regime change operations spearheaded by the U.S. government in this region within most people's living memory. On multiple occasions within the last 2 decades alone, we have seen militant extremist groups step into the power vacuum caused by these operations and begin to threaten American lives. Perhaps nowhere is this more keenly felt than in the country of Iraq. Of course, issues with this country did not begin in 2014 with the rise of ISIS, nor did they start in 2011 when American troops were hastily evacuated. And they did not originate in 2003 either, when the invasion and occupation of Iraq by U.S. and allied forces first began. To understand the beginning of the blowback problem in Iraq, it's necessary to go much further back in the timeline, all the way back to the rise of Saddam Hussein into political power and America's role in making it happen. When he was still a student at Al-Khar Secondary School in Baghdad in 1957, young Saddam Hussein decided to join a new and radical political movement called Baathism, which had the goal of uniting the entire Arab world under a single unified government and making it as strong as possible on the world stage. The Baathist Party hated 2 things. Well, actually, they pretty much hated almost everything. But the 2 things they hated most of all were Iraq's then-current military leader Abdul Karim Qasem and Marxist communism. They believed that General Qasem was basically a spineless weakling who didn't have what it takes to help Iraq realize its full potential, and they suspected that he secretly held communist sympathies. Consequently, they figured that the only reasonable option at their disposal was to make multiple assassination attempts against their leader and try to take over the government. Their first attempt in 1959 failed, and Saddam, who was a leading figure in the plot, ran away to Cairo to lay low and study law for a bit. Finally, in 1963, the Baathists pulled off a successful coup attempt, and Saddam Hussein was able to cash in on some nepotistic connections with an older cousin to score a very high-ranking position in the new government. The Ba'ath Party celebrated its victory by flexing on the Iraqi public and teabagging the old leader's bullet-riddled corpse on live television. Unfortunately for them, the Iraqi military was still loyal to the old guard and staged a counter-revolt, throwing Saddam and a bunch of his friends right into prison. They probably should have gone further than that and executed the Ba'athists for their mutiny, or at least put them in a prison with better security, but unfortunately they were a bunch of soft-on-crime liberals, so you know how that goes. In fact, it only took 2 years for Saddam Hussein to break out of prison and get right back with his friends in the Ba'athist party. Pretty soon, he was helping Team Ba'ath put together a private militia that they used to bully rival politicians and start up issues throughout the country. By 1968, they had amassed so much power and influence that they were able to overthrow the government yet again. This time, Saddam's cousin actually became the new president, and Saddam himself was put in an even more influential position in government than the one he had last time. For the next decade, Hussein and his cousin Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr ruled over Iraq like an Islamo-fascist Batman and Robin, using increasingly brutal tactics to keep the public in line. The crazy thing is, despite being far more brutal towards their own citizens and aggressive towards other nations in the region, especially in contrast to the previous government and the dwindling political opposition parties in Iraq, the Ba'ath Party enjoyed very strong support from the US government and received covert support from the CIA, including weapons and special intelligence briefings that allowed them to stay one step ahead of their political rivals. The US also openly provided diplomatic support for Iraq's government and stuck up for them whenever there were international disputes. This was a policy that persisted across multiple presidential administrations, with both Republican and Democratic governments supporting this policy. See, the US was in the midst of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the Ba'athist Party had one thing going for it, which was that it was extremely anti-communist. In fact, the United States liked what the Ba'athists were doing so much that it provided similar aid to other Ba'ath-affiliated movements that were trying to take over their own governments in places like Egypt and Syria. If you consider that America's stated goal in facing off against the Soviet Union was to safeguard democracy and human rights around the world, you may be confused by this choice of strategy. However, to the US government at the time, it didn't matter that the Ba'athist movement was objectively worse for the citizens that they took power over, not to mention the entire Middle East generally. Their antipathy to the Soviet Union was reason enough to keep giving them support.
So what happens now? That's what I've been trying to assess this week in Tehran, talking to the friends and enemies of Ayatollah Khomeini and experiencing at first hand just how bloody the situation could become. Ayatollah Khomeini returns to a country teetering on the brink of civil war. For the last 7 days, Tehran and other cities have seen violent clashes between troops and demonstrators demanding Khomeini's return. And this week, the crowds have shown that they are ready to fight back, pelting the soldiers with rocks and homemade petrol bombs. Inevitably, the result is massacre.
1979 was an incredibly important year for geopolitics in the Middle East. Up until that point, the Shiite country of Iran had been ruled by a leader called the Shah for decades. In 1953, the United States and the British government had an epic team-up moment and helped the Shah gain power over the country. His rule was extremely Western in style, with an emphasis on protecting human rights and individual liberties. Under his leadership, Iran was comparable in cultural and economic standing to many Western countries, with protections for ethnic and religious minorities and rights for women, including allowing them to get educated and own property. At the same time, the Shah was basically a puppet for Western interests, or at least that's how he was perceived by many of the Iranian people. A lot of the country's oil revenues ended up in the pockets of American and British nationals, and there was a great deal of concern by many of Iran's working and religious classes that international influence was essentially corrupting their country. Resentment built up for several years, until eventually a revolutionary party led by Ruhollah Khomeini successfully overthrew the Shah and turned Iran into an independent religious autocracy. This happened, of course, in 1979, and it sparked a long-running diplomatic crisis in which the United States attempted to free 50 hostages from the new revolutionary government. As you could probably imagine, the leaders of the United States government were not pleased about these developments. Not only because they now had to figure out how to rescue the hostages from Iran, but also because they had lost a favorable government in the Middle East. Meanwhile, another coup was taking place in 1979, this time in Iraq. Saddam Hussein turned on his cousin al-Bakr and had him executed after a public show trial. Saddam also wasn't happy about what had happened in Iran, and he decided to invade the country, both to keep it from getting any stronger under the rule of the new Ayatollah and to seize control of some of its oil. During the ensuing war between Iran and Iraq, the United States and many other world powers used their influence to prolong the conflict so that neither side could become too powerful. They did this by providing funding, weapons, and intelligence to both sides, which actually made the war last longer and become far more deadly. Most Western powers were basically ambivalent at first about who might win. But when Iraq almost went bankrupt, things suddenly changed. The United States put all its support behind the Iraqis, even when it was clear that they were illegally using sarin gas weapons, which paralyzed the nervous system of victims and caused them to slowly choke to death. Israel, on the other hand, had a different agenda. For reasons that are inexplicable to me, they had already been trying to arrange covert arms deals with the revolutionary Iranian government before the war even started. After the war began in earnest, and the United States made backing Iraq its official policy, the Reagan administration forbade Israel from giving U.S. money and weapons to the Iranians. That didn't stop them from going behind America's back and doing it anyway. Both governments were willfully playing with fire and emboldening a regime that had already engaged in mass brutality and radically anti-Western political activity. Once the U.S. went all in on helping Iraq win the war it had started against Iran, it wasn't long before Iraq caught a fat dub in the conflict and declared total victory in 1988. The Iranian people were pissed. Any hope that they might push back against the increasing radicalism of the Ayatollah was lost, because they remembered how the United States backed Iraq's hostile invasion of their country and played cover for Saddam Hussein's government when it illegally used chemical weapons against them. Towards the war's end, Iran went full throttle on nuclear research, which had previously ground to a halt after the Ayatollah took over, and began to establish agreements with countries like Russia and Argentina that would put it on the path towards developing a nuclear armada. It seems likely to me that if the U.S. had done a better job of staying impartial while policing the conflict, Iran would not have felt sufficiently threatened to make this move. Regardless, by the time the war ended and a new Ayatollah took over, the Iranian people were locked in on radicalism. A mass referendum was held in 1989 in Iran, leading to the passage of a sweeping constitutional amendment that consolidated the Ayatollah's powers and completely eliminated the last remaining vestiges of democracy in Iran. Permanently. Oops! Meanwhile, although its success against Iran put Iraq higher on the petroleum totem pole, its troubles were far from over. It costs a lot of money to invade another country, especially when that country is 5 times larger than yours and the invasion lasts for 8 years. Iraq owed billions of dollars in war debts, which Saddam Hussein hoped to pay off by trading a bunch of oil with other OPEC nations. Unfortunately for him, the price of crude oil kept falling, so the Iraqis had to harvest more and more of it in order to meet their target. To make matters even worse, the neighboring country of Kuwait was allegedly engaging in a practice known as slant drilling, which is basically where a country secretly siphons off another country's oil supply by sticking a giant straw into the ground at an angle, crossing national borders underground, and slurping that junk right up. As you might imagine, Saddam Hussein began looking at Kuwait with punitive intent. Conveniently enough, Iraq had a dormant historical claim to Kuwaiti territory dating back to the Ottoman Empire, one which Saddam started waving around ominously as he threatened to launch another invasion unless Kuwait straightened up its act.
I am going to commit great crime!
Now is a good time to pause and reflect. The year is 1990. The United States has by this point settled into its self-appointed role as the official referee of oil wars. Iraq has proven itself to be a capable military power, but it owes a non-negligible amount of credit for its success to the United States, which should give the United States some amount of diplomatic leverage. Bearing all this in mind, what do you think is the most rational course of action for the United States to take? Yeah, you want a video? If you picked issue a vague statement giving Iraq free rein to do whatever, then panic and go to war, congratulations, you got it exactly right. The U.S. ambassador to Iraq, April Glaspie, spoke on behalf of the United States and communicated an official position of neutrality, seemingly without regard to whatever decision the Iraqi government made about an invasion. Saddam Hussein took this as tacit approval, or at least a sign that the U.S. would not stand in his way, and he launched a full-scale invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990. President Bush kind of freaked out, and after minimal prodding from some allies, decided to completely reverse course on long-standing American policy and began spearheading an international military operation called Operation Desert Storm. This effort is widely held to have been extremely successful. After all, Iraq was successfully rebuffed, and the U.S. pulled it all off in less than a year. Operation Desert Storm lives on in American memory as one of the greatest foreign policy W's ever taken, especially in the minds of Gen X Republicans. But what I personally find extremely fascinating is the juxtaposition between the U.S. role in the Gulf War and its role in the prior war between Iraq and Iran. How could the U.S. go from supporting one preemptive Iraqi invasion of another sovereign nation to condemning and militarily opposing another one in less than 2 years? I reached out to political science professor Dr. Matthew Clary at my alma mater, Auburn University, to ask him this question. In his estimation, the thing that made the biggest difference was the receding influence of the Soviet Union. In 1988, the Soviet Union was still a major world player. By 1990, though, it was on the brink of collapse. American support for Saddam Hussein's government had basically been predicated on using Iraq against the Soviets. With that no longer being a major factor, the U.S. no longer had any obligation to keep things cordial with Iraq. The sheer whiplash of the change in stance also probably gave America a strategic advantage. Hussein was not expecting us to come swinging so hard after we just helped him pull off his last invasion. So, in a way, April Glaspie's mistake was kind of to the country's benefit. It's also worthwhile to point out that the United States very easily could have gotten stuck fighting against Iraq for considerably longer if it tried to expand the strategic scope of Operation Desert Storm. And that would have happened, too, if certain people had gotten their way. George W. Bush's cabinet included in its ranks a group colloquially known as the Vulcans. This hawkish group of foreign policy advisors believed that the United States didn't go far enough during the Gulf War, and in fact should have taken out Saddam Hussein when it got the chance. Consequently, the moment there were intelligence reports suggesting the merest possibility that Iraq under Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction, they leapt onto the chance to correct what they believed was a historical wrong. Now, as history has shown, there were, in fact, no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And in fact, the intelligence reports which they latched onto never really even suggested that there was strong evidence to suggest that there were in the first place. They really badly just wanted to correct what they thought was an error. And so they were kind of caught up in confirmation bias. You know, here's the excuse that we were looking for. Let's go start that war. Now, in my personal opinion, the time to take out Saddam Hussein probably passed about 30 or 40 years prior, because by the time the 21st century came around, really even before the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had so thoroughly consolidated power that the chance that any other group could take over and be able to hold authority over the region seemed really, really slim just from the outset. So, of course, it's no surprise that, as history has shown, terror groups took over in the power vacuum because literally any other opposition was so disorganized that only a might makes right violent group could take over. If there is any good news or happy ending to be found in this story, it's the fact that 10 years after ISIS first took over Mosul, Iraq has begun to bounce back to a state of peace and prosperity that it hasn't seen since before the U.S. invasion. Pessimists will say that the country has a long way to go before it reaches the standard of living expected of a first-world nation. Still, on the bright side, Iraq's major infrastructure is being rebuilt rather than blown up. People aren't being beheaded anymore, and the current Prime Minister, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, seems like a reasonable guy instead of a bloodthirsty warlord. For the first time in a long time, the Iraqi people have control of their own future, and that's something they can feel optimistic about. However, one country that's just a little bit harder to feel optimistic about is Afghanistan. The United States spent 20 years occupying that country, and what exactly is there to show for it? Let's talk about that.
Lyle, wake up! You gotta wake up, please!
Lyle, turn on the TV! They hit the Pentagon!
September 11th, 2001 was a day that will live on in infamy. On that day, as Representative Ilhan Omar so eloquently put it,
that some people did something?
That something was the death of 2,977 people from multiple simultaneous terror attacks by al-Qaeda under terrorist leader Osama bin Laden.
Turn on TV, it doesn't matter what channel.
In a manifesto justifying his heinous actions, Osama bin Laden accused the American government of promoting satanic values across the world and accused its people of being complicit in this. Bin Laden used the fact that Americans have the ability to vote for their leaders as justification for ascribing collective guilt to every single American, and he boldly threatened that more terror attacks might soon follow as a means of continuing to punish Americans for being part of a corrupt and immoral political system. Of course, it is wrong to suggest that just because people have some level of political representation, that it means every single person endorses every single thing their leaders do. So of course, it's insane to punish them collectively for the actions of a powerful minority. I hope you, the viewer, agree. This will be important later. Being attacked on the homeland by a foreign adversary galvanized militaristic and patriotic feelings among the general public. Support for the Bush administration skyrocketed, and political support for an interventionist foreign policy became almost unanimous across the country for a time. It even transformed the president's doctrine. He had run on a policy of non-intervention on the campaign trail during the previous year, but now was about to intervene in the affairs of another nation in a big way.
But we can't be all things to all people in the world, Jim. And I think that's where maybe the vice president and I begin to have some differences. I am worried about overcommitting our military around the world. I want to be judicious in its use. I'm not so sure the role of the United States is to go around the world and say this is the way it's got to be. We can help. And maybe it's just our difference in government, the way we view government. I mean, I want to empower people. I want to help people help themselves, not have government tell people what to do.
Of course, when a country is attacked by terrorists, it's only natural for the public and the government to feel that some sort of retribution is necessary. This does not necessarily mean that any action taken in the name of retribution is inherently justified. Of course, the ends do not justify the means, and revenge-seeking behavior can often backfire in a big way. This will also be important later. In November 2001, the United States began its invasion and 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. The war first began because the Bush administration believed the Afghani government was providing support and a place to hide for Osama bin Laden, and the objective was to put pressure on the government until they gave up their fugitive. It didn't take long for the objective of the war to completely change, as soon as the United States decided it was necessary to overthrow the Afghani government and establish a new regime. For 2 decades straight, the United States and Allied powers attempted to defend a weak puppet regime from resistance led by an al-Qaeda-affiliated political party called the Taliban. Trillions of dollars were spent and squandered, as well as tens of thousands of lives on both sides, and of course the result was a net zero benefit. Osama bin Laden turned up in Pakistan 10 years later, where he was killed by SEAL Team 6, and another 10 years after that, the United States pulled out of the country, leaving political control and a lot of expensive military equipment in the possession of the Taliban. It's really difficult to see the entire war as anything other than a massive waste of time, money, and human lives. What's perhaps more interesting than the war itself is the conditions that led to the war. Would it surprise you to know that 9/11 was the direct result of blowback from prior U.S. involvement in Afghanistan's politics? Just as the United States supported the Ba'athist Party against Soviet political agents in the 80s, only to fight the people it had emboldened not too much later. It likewise did the same with Mujahideen extremists during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Termed Operation Cyclone by the CIA, This collaboration between American and British intelligence from 1979 to 1992 involved using arms trades and information warfare to actively radicalize the Muslim population in Afghanistan and use their Islamic values as a bludgeon against the secular values of communism. From 1979 to 1985, this was done almost exclusively in secret. But the public declaration of the Reagan Doctrine in 1985 allowed Western powers to go ahead and do this more openly, even pushing messaging favoring the Mujahideen in popular culture. One famous example of this is the third Rambo movie, which was funded in part by the Department of Defense, and featured the titular hero working alongside Islamic radicals to save his friend Colonel Troutman from the communists. Admittedly, dealing with the Soviet occupation was a difficult situation. The Soviets were committing war crimes left and right, including deliberately targeting civilians and torturing them. Obviously, the United States can't abide by something like that. This is something that will be important later. At the same time, it's pretty darn clear, especially in hindsight, that mistakes were made. The US gave hundreds of millions of dollars in support to a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who ended up taking over the Afghanistan city of Kabul and was absolutely ruthless. Hekmatyar was the mentor of Osama bin Laden, and in many ways the progenitor of the group of Arab terrorists who became Al-Qaeda. The Mujahideen also gave birth to the Taliban in the mid-90s, and obviously we all know what happened after that. The US had the opportunity to back a different horse in the race, so to speak, and although we have no way of knowing how history might have played out differently if different decisions were made, we do know how things did play out based on the decisions that were made, to the tune of $2.3 trillion spent on a 2-decade-long quagmire that led to almost 250,000 dead human beings, and no improvement on net, either in the political situation of the Afghani people or the security of American interests in the region. The Al-Qaeda of Afghanistan were not the only infamous radical Islamic non-state terror group seeded and emboldened originally as a means of confronting communist influence in the Middle East. That same distinction is also shared by the Islamic resistance movement of Egypt and Palestine, otherwise known as Hamas. Here's the condensed version of the story, which I will extrapolate upon later. Hamas began, as many of these organizations do, as a more radical offshoot of a larger political sect that had already been operating in the Middle East. Its founder, Ahmed Yassin, was an affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood and a radical anti-communist nationalist. During the 1980s, Israel was dealing with violence and political resistance from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, which was backed by the Soviet Union and led by a political firebrand named Yasser Arafat. The Israeli government, under then Prime Minister Yitzhik Rabin, propped up the burgeoning Islamist organization and took on a cheerleading role as it took on more and more influence over the region for the next 20 years. In 2006, an election in the Palestinian territory jointly sponsored by Israel and the United States led to a Hamas victory over Yasser Arafat's Fatah party. By that point, members of Hamas had already committed many acts of sporadic violence, including attempted assassinations of Israeli government officials and suicide bombings. Nevertheless, officials in the Israeli government, including under the current Netanyahu administration, continued to allow the operation of a Qatari slush fund to line the pockets of Hamas operatives for years, figuring that as long as they could use the Islamist right wing to keep fighting the Palestinian left wing, both groups would be too busy fighting each other to bother launching a large-scale attack against Israel. This proved to be true, but only temporarily.
Colonel David Hakam, who worked in Gaza in the late 1980s as an Arab affairs expert in the Israeli military, has admitted that the original sin was Israeli support for Yassin in the late 70s. But at the time, he has argued, nobody thought about the possible results. Well, Avner Cohen did. Cohen was the Israeli official who was responsible for religious affairs in Gaza for more than 2 decades, and who now says, quote, "Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation." Yeah, Cohen's words. He actually wrote an official report to his superiors in the mid-1980s, warning them not to play divide and rule in the occupied territories and calling on Israel to, quote, "break up this monster before this reality jumps in our face." But no one else on the Israeli side really took the possibility of blowback seriously at that time.
The PLO, Fatah, and other affiliated left-wing groups continued to recede in influence as Hamas became stronger and stronger. And of course, as most of you probably already know, things came to a head on October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched the largest terror attack in Israel's history, killing 1,200 Israeli civilians and taking an additional 251 Israelis hostage. In many respects, The attack on October 7th of last year was Israel's version of 9/11, and the ensuing war between the IDF and Hamas has many striking similarities to the U.S. war with Afghanistan, which I will examine in greater detail shortly. For now, I want to sidebar and talk about the nature of America's relationship as a formal partner with the State of Israel. I'm here at the Arlington National Cemetery, which is the official burial ground for American soldiers who died in war. Most people know it for the tomb of the unknown soldier, but tucked away in this quiet little corner of the cemetery stands a monument to the casualties of the USS Liberty, an American naval ship that was shot down on June 8, 1967. 34 American servicemen were killed, and another 171 injured during the attack. But the most curious thing about it is the question of who perpetrated the attack and why. At the beginning of June 1967, Israel launched a blitzkrieg invasion of Egypt and Jordan, using overwhelming force directed in multiple directions as a gambit to capture new territory and expand the borders of the country, which had been established by the United Nations in 1948. At that time, the USS Liberty was given orders to redirect from its course near Spain so it could navigate closer to the conflict and collect intelligence about the ongoing situation. The United States was considering intervening on Israel's behalf, but senior officials were concerned about the political consequences of intervening if Israel was acting as an aggressor. On the 7th of June, Israeli leadership began official preparations for a preemptive attack on the Golan Heights region of Syria, which would change its strategy from a two-pronged attack to a three-pronged one. It was a deliberate policy decision to keep the United States in the dark about this, out of fear that the move would be perceived as too aggressive for the U.S. to support. The plan was not to let any word get out until the attack had already been made, by which point it could be spun in any way necessary to be palatable to the public. The USS Liberty, meanwhile, was inching ever closer to the area, and was in range to intercept Israeli communications. If the Israelis didn't act quickly, the secret would get out. On the morning of the 8th, they fired a barrage of bullets at the vessel, incapacitating it and killing a large fraction of the crew. Israeli political leadership denied having any knowledge of the USS Liberty's identity as an American vessel. The crew on the Liberty claimed differently. In a written testimony, survivor James Ennis Jr. cited multiple attempts to make radio contact before the firing began, as well as multiple forms of American insignia being clearly and prominently displayed on the outside of the ship, which was fully visible in the clear weather conditions of the day. By all rights, there is no reasonable possibility that the attack was a mistake. The survivors of the attack pressed their government for an investigation, but in fact a cover-up was well underway. The Pentagon put a gag order on the media and threatened extrajudicial punishment on any survivors who attempted to publicly speculate about the event as anything other than an accident. For several decades, the USS Liberty Veterans Association took on the mission of putting political pressure on Congress to find out once and for all the truth about the events of June 8, 1967. Of course, like the Bible says, everything that is hidden comes to light eventually. Declassified NSA files and senior official testimonies revealed decades later what the head honchos knew all along, that the attack on the USS Liberty had been deliberate. Fearing for their jobs and reputations, a group of political power brokers that even included President Lyndon Johnson went all in on a shameful cover-up so as not to disrupt the balance of power in the Middle East. This attack, which took place in the middle of what later became known as the Six-Day War, was not the last time that the United States would be let down by her greatest ally. Israel's aggression during the Six-Day War became the catalyst for the formation of the PLO and other Islamic movements which opposed the security interests of the Jewish state. When Israel later invaded Lebanon in 1982, it triggered the formation of the terrorist group Hezbollah in reaction, a group which Israel is still at war with today. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Israel deliberately seated Hamas as an opposition party that quickly got out of control. Unfortunately, in the midst of all this blowback, the United States has continuously been reeled in over and over. The United States went all in on helping write a series of massive peace treaties between Israel and the PLO in 1993 called the Oslo Accords, and another treaty with Jordan in 1994. The result of this set of agreements was the mutual recognition of both Israel and Palestine as political entities, and an end to officially sanctioned violence. This peace was short-lived, as Israel's moderate prime minister was assassinated by a political extremist the next year, only to be replaced by a hardliner. And rogue Palestinian militants also violated the terms of the agreement with random acts of political violence. The right-wing government, which replaced Yitzhak Rabin in Israel, accused the PLO of being responsible for the violence by Islamist radicals, which Yasser Arafat and other leaders denied, citing evidence that those radicals had acted independently. Both parties gradually reneged on the terms of the agreement. Israelis built more and more settlements inside of territory that had been afforded to Palestinians, and Islamist leaders started tacitly and financially supporting terror groups wherever it was convenient. By 1997, none of the treaties were worth the paper they were written on, and the United States was stuck in the impossible situation of trying once again to stop the belligerent extremists on either side of the conflict from ruining things for everyone else. In 2000, a Palestinian uprising erupted into a war that lasted for at least 5 years and gradually petered off, but not without leaving lasting and irreparable damage on relations between both sides. The United States tried and failed to strike peace deals at Camp David on multiple occasions, and was billed for billions of dollars in military and humanitarian aid to both the Israelis and the Palestinians. Unfortunately, the current humanitarian crisis that began in October of last year is not helping matters. The Hamas attack in October of last year reopened old wounds, and Israel's government has been seeking a Pyrrhic victory against the Islamic organization at all costs, with Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu refusing to sign any ceasefire agreement until Hamas is completely obliterated and all Israeli hostages accounted for. To return to my previous analogy between the attack by Hamas in October 2023 and the attack on the United States by al-Qaeda in September 2001, and explain why the comparison is so apt, I'll begin pointing out the similarities. Both terror attacks were perpetrated by organizations that were originally seeded and developed by the victimized country as a means of leveraging political power against another, now defunct, adversary. Both terror attacks are significantly larger than any that either country had ever previously experienced in their respective histories, both in terms of sheer human tragedy and physical damage to infrastructure. Both of the countries, when attacked, had been hubristically ignoring the imminence of their respective terrorist threats. And finally, perhaps most importantly at this point, both the United States and Israel responded by launching military offensives whose scope and destructiveness greatly exceeded the mandate of response and jeopardized the international standing of both countries. The question of who started it is only important for so long. Israel's strategy since the October 7th attack has been to take a scorched earth approach to the Palestinian territories of Gaza, which has grotesquely inflicted damage upon civilian lives and infrastructure. The rote defense of this strategy by citing Hamas's alleged use of human shields is an intentional oversimplification of the situation on the part of the Israeli government, in an attempt to hand-wave away any accountability for the reckless abandon with which the IDF has pummeled Rafah, Khan Yunis, and the other territories of the Gaza Strip. It does not begin to excuse the fact that 370,000 homes, 32 hospitals, and 494 schools have been destroyed since the conflict started 8 months ago. Surely some of this civilian infrastructure could have been cleared by boots on the ground if there were terrorists inside, rather than indiscriminately destroying their entire sites by airstrikes and missile launches. Nor does it excuse the fact that 45% or more of Israel's launch projectiles have been unguided dumb bombs. Israel's military has the capacity to launch targeted strikes that go after specific targets. The use of ballistics with no targeting capacity indicates that they are only concerned with inflicting maximum damage as cheaply as possible. Hamas, allegedly using human shields, a claim that has not always held up under greater scrutiny, does not excuse the fact that IDF soldiers have marched into the civilian homes of Muslims and Christians alike living in the Palestinian territory, and filmed themselves laughing as they smashed civilian belongings or raided their closets and dressed up in their clothes. It does not excuse the fact that 60% of the Palestinian casualties since October 7th have been women and children, nor does it excuse the mass rapes of Palestinian women and girls by Israeli soldiers, many of which have been caught on camera and even bragged about by IDF soldiers in public social media posts. It does not excuse the fact that Israeli drones accidentally shot 3 of the Israeli hostages taken by Hamas during the attack, who thought they had escaped their captors, only to be killed by their own government because they were mistaken for Palestinians. It does not excuse the fact that a fire that broke out at a refugee camp during an Israeli strike and killed 45 human beings, while gravely injuring 200 more, was chalked up to a clerical error by the Netanyahu regime, whose response was to allegedly launch an opaque and paltry internal investigation into the matter. I ask you this: when has any government ever investigated its own actions in secret and returned with a result finding itself to be at fault? Perhaps most egregiously at all, it is never ever acceptable to disguise a military convoy as a humanitarian aid truck. Using the imagery of neutral humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross to wage military campaigns is considered to be one of the gravest war crimes a government can commit, because of the splash damage that it can do to further humanitarian efforts down the line. Unfortunately, that's exactly what Israel did early in June, when it sent IDF soldiers to the Nusayrat camp, firing indiscriminately and killing 274 people, just to rescue 4 of its own nationals. It is not a coincidence that after Israel's recent raid to rescue those hostages, the entire war cabinet of Netanyahu was dissolved, after a leading member resigned in protest. These are some of the most hardline Zionist Jews on the planet, who wake up every day thinking about how to obliterate Hamas. And even they thought Bibi's actions were a bridge too far. Netanyahu's government is already mired by serious accusations of corruption, and the entire strategy for fighting in Palestinian territory has been deeply unpopular among Israel's citizens. So the question is, why are so many officials in our government, including both the president's cabinet and bipartisan members of the Congress, marching in lockstep with everything Netanyahu's government does? The answer is very simple. It is because of the foreign lobby AIPAC, otherwise known as the American-Israeli Political Action Committee. AIPAC is one of the most influential and powerful lobbying groups in Washington, D.C., and unlike similarly well-funded lobbying groups like the NRA or Open Society Foundation that almost exclusively donate to only one political party or the other, it attempts to influence the Republicans and Democrats in almost equal measure. As Republican Representative Thomas Massie explains it, every politician on Capitol Hill has an AIPAC person.
And I have Republicans who come to me and say, that's wrong what AIPAC is doing to you. Let me talk to my AIPAC person. By the way, everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What does that mean, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are, firmly embedded in AIPAC. And
every member has something like this?
I don't know how it works on the Democrat side, but that's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to D.C., you go have lunch with them.
Politicians are pressured to mention and endorse Israel whenever they can, lest they face the wrath of AIPAC, as it bankrolls primary challengers and funds mudslinging smear campaigns targeting voters. This is exactly what happened to Thomas Massie when he became one of the lone dissenting voices on the Republican side about Israel. And likewise, the exact same thing was done to Democratic Representative Jamal Bowman. Since the very beginning of our nation's history, there have been concerns about the integrity of our political system if it were to fall under foreign influence. In his 1796 farewell address, which was prophetic in many respects, President George Washington warned that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. He continues with an ominous note that real patriots, who may resist the intrigues of the favorite country, are liable to become suspected and odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests. Of course, this is exactly what AIPAC hopes to achieve with its influence over our elections. Ostensibly, AIPAC is a lobby for our foreign government. Since 1938, all foreign lobbies have been obliged to publicly register as such under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, in the interest of transparency. After being registered, if the foreign lobby attempts to exert influence over the government that would compromise its own interests, its donations and campaigns can be challenged in court. For mysterious reasons, the congressmen whose campaigns are bankrolled by AIPAC have never voted to classify the PAC as a foreign lobby, so it has managed to elude accountability under FARA.
I said on the McLaughlin group in response to a question, Jim, they said, do you think that the Congress of the United States will resist this demand for further aid? I said, through a crack I'd heard. I said, no, the Congress of the United States is Israeli-occupied territory. What I meant by that is, and I don't think the automatic votes of the Congress of the United States for $3 and $4 billion worth of aid to Israel are necessarily in the national interest of the United States. And that comment, which is to ridicule the subservience of the Congress of the United States, is perfectly valid.
You might be thinking I'm being alarmist. Some of you may be thinking, surely AIPAC cannot be that influential, or perhaps if they are, their influence is only felt in theaters of war on the other side of the world. In fact, AIPAC's influence has been directly responsible for domestic policies that restrict American civil liberties and directly compromise the integrity of our nation's sovereignty. In 2019, the 116th Congress of the United States made a final vote on a bill which would restrict the right of individuals and businesses to boycott the State of Israel or participate in a movement called BDS, in which private citizens voluntarily withhold their own money from the Israeli government by refusing to enter into contracts that would benefit it. The ability to boycott is widely recognized as a human right, and one would assume that in a country built off of free market principles, our government would abide by allowing its citizens to do whatever they want with their own money. Unfortunately, one would be naive. The anti-BDS policy, which was originally filed under the name of House Resolution 246 by the prior Congress and approved by a bipartisan supermajority of House representatives, was quietly shuffled into Senate Bill No. 1, at the very top of 116th Congress's docket, meaning that it was literally the highest priority of that Congress, above and beyond any economic or social issue of concern to the voters. Here, it passed with another bipartisan supermajority, 77 in favor versus 23 against. The bill became law, and ever since then, it has been possible for state and local governments to completely divest against any individual or business who boycotts Israel, while said divested individual is legally barred from being able to raise litigation in defense in court. The weaponization of civil litigation law to serve the interests of the State of Israel does not stop there. Since the attack by Hamas, AIPAC's influence has expanded with a renewed vigor. This year, a bill supposedly created to fight anti-Semitism passed the House, which would create a chilling effect on free speech if signed into law. It plugs a definition of anti-Semitism created by an international body and constantly subject to change into the federal government's interpretation and enforcement of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. This organization, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, operates out of Germany and Sweden, meaning that it is completely unaccountable to the United States government. Its definition of anti-Semitism currently includes any criticism of the government of Israel which is subjectively judged to be disproportionate or unfair, as well as any teachings of Christianity that suggest Jews as a group were culpable for the death of Jesus Christ. In practice, this means that any Jewish student at an American university who witnesses a Palestinian protest or preaching of certain Bible verses on campus can sue the university under a Title VI civil rights violation claim and put the kibosh on either activity permanently. Not only is the structure of this bill a violation of our nation's sovereignty by a foreign international body, but its practice will lead to violations of both the right to peaceably protest and freedom of religion. It passed the House by a vote of 320 in favor versus 91 against, and is expected to slide through the Senate with ease to be passed into law. The question has to be asked: for what reason is the United States government so ready and willing to sacrifice its own founding principles at the behest of a foreign government? What do we actually stand to gain from this? In war theaters abroad, it is obviously true that organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas are populated by dangerous, violent, and cruel people who engage in their fair share of war crimes and atrocities against civilians. But for what reason is the United States called upon over and over by Israel to bankroll their fight against them and other adversaries? Let alone, why are our politicians being so strongly pressured to blindly support any strategy concocted by the Israeli government in the name of anti-terrorism, whether it is humane or effective or not? All this does is further draw the ire of these terrorist organizations toward the United States, when they might otherwise have no strategic reason to pick on us. And every atrocity committed by an ally of ours, be it Israel or any other country, only serves as a powerful tool of recruitment by extremist groups, hoping to enlist people to their cause who lost loved ones as collateral damage by these poorly conceived military campaigns. This concludes my thoughts on blowback in the Middle East. I'll let former Texas Representative Ron Paul summarize the points that I've made during the last half hour.
In many ways, what's happening in the Middle East, and in particular with Gaza right now, we have some moral responsibility for both sides in a way, because we provide help and funding for both Arab nations and Israel. And so we definitely have a moral responsibility, and especially now today, the weapons being used to kill so many Palestinians are American weapons, and American funds essentially are being used for this. But there's a political liability, which I think is something that we fail to look at, because too often there's so much blowback from our intervention in areas that we shouldn't be involved in. You know, Hamas, if you look at the history, you'll find out that Hamas was encouraged and really started by Israel, because they wanted Hamas to counteract Yasser Arafat. And you say, well, yeah, that was better then and served its purpose, but we didn't want Hamas to do this. So then we as Americans say, well, we have such a good system, we're going to impose this on the world. We're going to invade Iraq and teach people how to be Democrats. We want free elections. So we encourage the Palestinians to have a free election. They do, and they elect Hamas. So we first indirectly and directly through Israel help establish Hamas. Then we have election. Then Hamas becomes dominant, so we have to kill them. You know, it just doesn't make sense. During the 80s, you know, we were allied with Osama bin Laden, and we were contending with the Soviets. It was at that time our CIA thought it was good if we radicalized the Muslim world. So we financed the madrasa schools to radicalize the Muslims in order to compete with the Soviets. There's too much blowback. There's a lot of reasons why we should oppose this resolution. It is not in the interest of the United States. It's not in the interest of Israel either.
In popular conceptions of foreign policy, there is a false dichotomy between, on the one hand, appeasement, and on the other hand, constant antagonism. When dealing with hostile foreign regimes, we have to realize that they are not completely one-dimensional. While it's true that there are some things that we may never see eye to eye on, it's also true that sometimes there's a reason why they're in their current state of hostility. It's for this reason that I think that we need to have a foreign policy of strict pragmatism, one where we take an objective look at what's going on and where we try to make amends for our mistakes. It does absolutely no one any good to constantly be picking fights, constantly stick by alliances that are outmoded or don't make any sense in the current state of affairs. Instead, we need foreign policy leaders who are savvy, who understand what exactly is going on and can look at things without bias and without any sense of prior commitment. Unfortunately, our politicians are bought off by foreign lobbies, which I don't think I need to name. If you know, you know. And so that's why I think we need to really reify, put focus back on the idea that politicians are loyal to this country first.
This is MAGA? This is what MAGA's supposed to be.
Well, you don't know me, but I know you, and I'm gonna sleep to give to you. Here comes the rain. So you better get ready, ready to go. You can come to my life. Pay as you go. Pay as you go. There's no rain, no blue light shall stay these warriors from swift completion of their appointed round.